Hello everyone, welcome to my channel.
My name is Monica. I am 28 years old, and I have just returned to America after 3 grueling years working in the freezing industrial seafood plants of Niigata, Japan. I survived those bitter winters working 16-hour shifts until my fingers bled just to send every yen back home to support my family. I expected a warm welcome, but the moment I stepped into the living room, my mother Deborah lunged toward me and yelled directly into my face. I watched your child for 3 years pay me $200,000 in childcare fees right now. Before I could even process the shock, my brother Travis looked around the house, adjusted his expensive watch, and added with a smug grin, "Not enough. You've been selfishly hoarding your foreign income while we struggled here. Transfer this house to the family immediately to settle your debt, or you won't be taking your daughter Chloe anywhere." I looked at my child, who was hiding behind a tattered curtain, looking malnourished and terrified of the very people I had been slave laboring to feed. I saw Travis's wife Melanie smirking as she clutched a designer handbag that I knew my money had bought. Instead of screaming or crying, a strange cold calm washed over me. I looked at their greedy faces and smiled, nodding slowly. "Fine," I replied. "If that is what you think I owe, I agree to everything." They cheered, thinking they had finally broken me, but they had no idea my smile was a death sentence for their greed. 5 months later, they were shocked when the real bill arrived, and by then it was far too late to beg for mercy. Before we continue with my story, please let me know what time it is and which city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has traveled. If you believe my mother's demands are outrageous, please hit the subscribe button and leave a comment to support the channel. 3 years ago, when my father passed away, leaving behind a mountain of medical debts and a crumbling mortgage, I made the agonizing choice to leave my 3-year-old daughter Chloe behind to seek a lifeline in the industrial heart of Niigata, Japan. The memories of those early days still haunt me like a persistent chill that no American heater can ever truly thaw. Niigata was a world of relentless gray skies and snow that piled up higher than the factory fences, a stark contrast to the sunny suburbs of Illinois I had left behind. I spent my days in a massive, windowless seafood processing plant where the air smelled of brine and ammonia, and the temperature was kept just above freezing to preserve the catch. My job was to stand at a conveyor belt for 16 hours at a stretch, my hands submerged in ice-cold water as I gutted and sorted thousands of fish until my fingers lost all sensation and turned a bruised, ghostly purple. Every night I would crawl back to a tiny, unheated dormitory room, my back aching so intensely that I had to sleep on the floor just to keep my spine straight. I lived on instant noodles and discounted rice balls from the local convenience store, spending less than $5 a day on myself so that I could send every single remaining yen back to my mother Deborah. I remember the exhaustion so deep that I would sometimes hallucinate Chloe's laughter in the hum of the factory machinery. During our brief weekly FaceTime calls, my mother would always paint a picture of domestic harmony, telling me how expensive Chloe's preschool was and how much she needed extra funds for unexpected house repairs. I believed every word. I sent thousands of dollars every month via Western Union, totaling nearly $400,000 over the 3-year period, thinking I was building a golden future for my daughter and providing a comfortable retirement for the woman who raised me. My brother Travis would often join the calls, complaining about his back injuries that prevented him from working, while his wife Melanie nodded in the background, telling me they were praying for my strength. I felt a sense of pride, believing I was the hero of my family, the one who sacrificed her youth and health in the freezing dark of Niigata to keep the lights on back in the States. I never questioned why my mother always asked for more, nor did I suspect that my hard-earned money was being filtered through a web of lies. I worked through pneumonia, through loneliness that felt like a physical weight, and through the crushing guilt of missing my child's first steps and first words. I clung to the promise that my sacrifice would be recognized, that my return would be a celebration of our collective survival. The reality of my homecoming was not just a slap in the face, it was a total annihilation of the person I used to be. Every dollar I sent was a drop of my own blood, and as I stood in my living room facing their greed, I realized they hadn't just spent my money, they had feasted on my life. The first night back in my own house felt like staying in a hostile stranger's home, and it didn't take long for the polished facade of my family's life to start crumbling. While my mother and Travis were busy celebrating my agreement to their demands in the dining room, I walked quietly toward the back of the house to find Chloe. I expected to find her in the bright, spacious bedroom I had specifically paid to have remodeled for her before I left, but the door was locked and used as a storage closet for Melanie's endless collection of designer shoeboxes. I eventually found my daughter in a cramped, windowless pantry converted into a makeshift bedroom next to the laundry room. The air was damp, and she was sleeping on a thin-stained mattress on the floor, huddled under a threadbare blanket that looked like it had been salvaged from a garage sale. My heart shattered into a million jagged pieces when I saw her small, pale face. She looked malnourished. Her hair was matted and the expensive preschool my mother bragged about was clearly a lie, as her room was filled with cheap broken toys from the dollar store. I stepped back into the kitchen, my blood boiling, and noticed the refrigerator was covered in photos of Travis and Melanie on lavish vacations in Maui and Aspen trips they supposedly took while I was gutting fish in Niigata. I opened the trash can and saw receipts for $500 steak dinners and boutique shopping sprees, all dated within the last month. The contrast was sickening. My daughter was being treated like an unwanted servant in her own home while her uncle and aunt lived like royalty on my sweat and tears. Melanie walked into the kitchen draped in a silk robe I recognized from a luxury brand and didn't even acknowledge my presence as she poured herself a glass of expensive wine. She looked at me with a smirk, her eyes scanning my worn-out clothes and rough skin as if I were the intruder. When I asked her why Chloe wasn't in her original room, she simply shrugged and said that Travis needed the space for his home office, and that kids didn't need much room anyway. The audacity of her statement made my ears ring, but I forced myself to remain silent, knowing that an emotional outburst would only alert them to my growing suspicion. I watched my mother dote on Travis's son, giving him a brand new tablet, while Chloe sat silently in the corner, ignored by everyone. It became painfully clear that my family didn't see me as a sister or a daughter. I was merely a distant bank account, a resource to be exploited until it ran dry. They had spent 3 years gaslighting me, using my love for my child as a weapon to extort more money, while they systematically neglected the very person I was working for. Every emergency they had reported to me, the roof leaks that never happened. The medical bills that were fabricated was a calculated move to fund Melanie's vanity and Travis's laziness. I realized then that my father's death had removed the only moral compass in this house, leaving behind a den of thieves, led by the woman who gave me birth. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor next to Chloe's mattress, watching her sleep, and making a silent vow that this would be the last night she ever suffered under this roof. The woman who returned from Niigata was no longer the naive girl who left Illinois. I was a survivor who had learned to endure the cold, and I was about to bring a winter of my own to this house. The following morning, I slipped out of the house before sunrise, telling my mother I needed to visit the local Social Security office to update my records. But my real destination was a secluded diner on the edge of town to meet my Uncle Greg. As the younger brother of my late father, Greg was the only person who had ever shown me genuine honesty, and the grim expression on his face as he sat in a corner booth told me that the truth was worse than I imagined. He didn't waste time on pleasantries, instead, sliding a thick manila folder across the scratched laminate table, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and barely suppressed rage. I opened the folder to find a meticulously organized stack of bank statements, Western Union receipts, and printed social media posts that documented a 3-year timeline of systemic theft. My hands began to shake as I looked at the numbers over the past 36 months. I had sent back a total of nearly $400,000, but according to the records Greg had subpoenaed through his connections, only 10% of that money had ever touched my daughter's needs or the household utilities. The remaining 90%, a staggering $360,000, had been diverted into a private offshore account controlled by Melanie, which she then filtered back into Travis's personal spending fund. I stared at the evidence of their decadence line items for a $50,000 luxury SUV registered in Travis's name, a series of high-end plastic surgery invoices for Melanie, and thousands of dollars spent at designer boutiques in Chicago. While I was standing in freezing slush in Niigata, surviving on expired rice balls to save for Chloe's college fund, my brother and his wife were literally burning my life's blood on vanity and status. Uncle Greg leaned in his voice, a low, urgent whisper explaining that my mother had been the primary facilitator, signing off on every transfer, and even helping Melanie forge my signature on several credit applications. They hadn't just used the money I sent, they had used my identity to rack up an additional $40,000 in high-interest consumer debt, effectively destroying my American credit score while I was thousands of miles away. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to my chest, a cold vacuum of air that left me gasping for breath in that quiet diner. Greg pointed to a specific set of documents at the bottom of the pile, showing that the property taxes on my house hadn't been paid in 2 years because Deborah had used the tax money to pay off Travis's gambling debts at a local casino. They were planning to let the house fall into tax foreclosure after I signed it over to them, hoping to buy it back at an auction, using the very cash they had stolen from me, thereby wiping out my ownership and any legal claim I had to the property. Every FaceTime call, every "I love you" from my mother, and every "thank you sis" from Travis was a calculated performance designed to keep the Japanese yen flowing into their pockets. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with a greedy family. I was dealing with a criminal enterprise operating under the guise of kinship. My mother's demand for $200,000 wasn't a reimbursement for childcare. It was a final desperate grab to drain the last of my savings before I discovered their crimes. I looked up at Uncle Greg, the tears in my eyes drying into a hard, crystalline resolve, and asked him for the name of the best lawyer in the county. I wasn't going to just take my daughter and run. I was going to ensure that every single cent they stole would become a millstone around their necks. Greg nodded, scribbling a name and number on a napkin. Mr. Sterling, a man known for his expertise in complex property fraud and a reputation for being as cold as a Niigata winter. As I left the diner, the folder tucked tightly under my arm, I felt the last remnants of my familial love dissolve into a singular burning desire for justice. They wanted my money and my house, and I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, along with every hidden liability they were too stupid to foresee. The office of Mr. Sterling was as sharp and intimidating as the man himself, a space filled with dark mahogany and the scent of expensive tobacco that commanded immediate respect. I sat across from him for 3 hours laying out the evidence Greg had provided and explaining the absurd demands my mother and Travis had made upon my return. Sterling didn't flinch when I told him I intended to agree to their terms. Instead, he leaned back, a predatory glint appearing in his eyes, as he realized I wasn't looking for a defense, but a weapon. He explained that, in the state of Illinois, transferring a property title through a gift deed or a quitclaim deed carried immense legal weight, especially regarding the assumption of existing liabilities. We spent the afternoon crafting a very specific legally binding agreement that looked on the surface like a total surrender to my mother's wishes. I returned home that evening with the documents tucked inside a nondescript envelope, finding the trio gathered in the living room like a council of vultures waiting for a carcass to stop twitching. Melanie was already scrolling through interior design websites, talking loudly about which walls she was going to tear down once the house was officially hers, while Travis sipped a beer, his eyes darting to the envelope in my hand. I sat down at the dining table, my expression a mask of defeated exhaustion, and told them that I had consulted with a legal aid volunteer and decided that family harmony was more important than property. Deborah's face lit up with a sickening, triumphant glow as she grabbed the papers, her eyes scanning only for the words, transfer of ownership, and $200,000. Sure. What she didn't realize, because Sterling had buried it in dense, specialized legal jargon, was a series of ironclad clauses stating that by accepting the title and the cash settlement, the new owners were also assuming absolute personal liability for all back taxes, municipal fines, and the undisclosed second mortgage that Melanie had fraudulently taken out in my name. Furthermore, I had included a covenant of indemnity, which meant that if the IRS or any bank came looking for the missing 90% of my diverted income, Deborah and Travis would be legally responsible for the unexplained wealth and any associated tax evasion penalties. I watched as they practically fought over the pen to sign the documents, their greed blinding them to the fact that they were signing a confession of financial responsibility for their own crimes. I played the part of the broken daughter to perfection, even shedding a few fake tears as I told them I would need 30 days to process my emotions and find a small apartment for me and Chloe. Travis laughed, telling me there was no rush since he was now the man of the house, and he would graciously allow me to stay until the end of the month as long as I kept doing the cooking and cleaning. Melanie even had the audacity to ask me if I had any more Japanese yen left over that I could donate to the house renovation fund. I simply nodded, promising them that everything would be settled within 5 months. As I watched them toast to their victory with the expensive wine I had paid for, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction that surpassed anything I had felt in Niigata. They thought they had successfully extorted a fortune from a weary mother, but they had actually just accepted a Trojan horse of debt fraud and legal catastrophe. That night, I went to the pantry where Chloe was sleeping and whispered into her ear that our nightmare was almost over. I wasn't just giving them a house, I was giving them a prison of their own making, constructed from the bricks of their own avarice and the mortar of their lies. The house was no longer my burden. It was a ticking financial time bomb, and I had just handed them the detonator while they were too busy admiring the gold-plated casing. 2 weeks after the signing, I packed our lives into 5 suitcases while the house was empty, as Travis and Melanie had taken my mother on a celebratory shopping spree, using the last of the emergency fund I had supposedly left in the kitchen drawer. I didn't leave a note or a forwarding address. I simply picked up Chloe from the pantry, took her hand, and walked out the front door for what I knew would be the very last time. Uncle Greg was waiting at the end of the driveway in his old truck, his face set in a grim mask of approval as he helped me load our belongings and drove us to a small, secure apartment he had rented for me in a neighboring county under a corporate name. For the next 5 months, I maintained an absolute suffocating silence, changing my phone number and deactivating every social media account that could link me to my former life. I spent those months healing, watching the color return to Chloe's cheeks as she finally ate nutritious meals and slept in a warm, soft bed with her own stuffed animals. However, while I was finding peace, the trap I had set back at the house was beginning to tighten its iron grip around my mother and brother, Because they had signed the gift deed and the assumption of liability, the local tax assessor's office and the bank were now legally required to send all past due notices directly to the new owners of record, Deborah and Travis. They had spent 3 years living as parasites, never bothering to understand how a household actually functions in the United States, assuming that money would always just magically appear from Niigata. Without my monthly wire transfers of $10,000, their extravagant lifestyle hit a brick wall at full speed within 30 days. First, the luxury SUV was repossessed from the driveway because Melanie missed 3 consecutive payments she thought I would cover. Then the utility companies began sending final notice letters printed on bright red paper, which Travis likely ignored, thinking they were just junk mail. But the real killing blow was the property tax foreclosure notice. In Illinois, if you assume a title, you assume the back taxes, and because Deborah had squandered the tax money I sent years ago, the county was now demanding over $50,000 in immediate payments, or the house would be put up for auction. They had no savings, no credit, and no income, as Travis had spent years refusing to work, claiming his back injury was too severe. I heard from Uncle Greg that they had tried to call my old number hundreds of times, likely intending to demand more money or blame me for the errors in the paperwork. They were trapped in a mansion they couldn't heat, driving a car they didn't own, and facing a legal system that didn't care about their excuses. Every time I thought of them sitting in that darkening house, I remembered the freezing winds of Niigata and the bruised purple of my fingers, and I felt not a single shred of guilt. They had feasted on my youth and my daughter's childhood, and now they were finally being forced to pay the bill. The 5 months of silence wasn't just for my protection. It was the gestation period for their total financial ruin, a time during which their own greed would slowly suffocate them until they were desperate enough to do something truly stupid. I knew they would eventually try to reach out to the extended family to paint me as the villain, and I was counting on it. I was waiting for the perfect moment to reappear, not as the victim they remembered, but as the witness to their crimes. The opportunity for the final confrontation arrived on the occasion of my Aunt Martha's 30th wedding anniversary, a grand family gathering where the entire extended clan would be present. I knew Deborah, Travis, and Melanie would attend, desperate to put on a show of wealth and perhaps even beg for loans from our relatives under the guise of temporary cash flow issues. When I walked into the banquet hall with Chloe, who was now radiant and healthy in a beautiful blue dress, the room went silent as if a ghost had just walked through the doors. My mother's face went through a terrifying transformation from shock to feigned relief, and finally to a mask of blistering rage. She lunged toward me, not to hug me, but to grab my arm and hiss into my ear that I had abandoned the family and that the house was being stolen by the bank because of my incompetence. Tsuku. Travis stood behind her, looking disheveled and frantic, while Melanie looked like a shadow of her former self, her designer clothes now wrinkled and her jewelry likely pawned. "You lied to us, Monica." Travis shouted loud enough for the aunts and uncles to turn their heads. "You gave us a house that was drowning in debt. You're a cold-blooded snake for doing this to your own mother." I didn't raise my voice. I simply signaled to Uncle Greg, who stood up and walked to the front of the room with a portable projector and a stack of folders. Before the entire family, I began to speak, my voice steady and cold as a Niigata blizzard. I explained that I had sent over $400,000 home to support my child and my mother, only to return to find my daughter sleeping in a pantry while 90% of my earnings disappeared. I flipped to the first slide on the screen, a side-by-side comparison of my Western Union receipts from Japan and Melanie's secret bank statements. The room gasped as they saw the $50,000 SUV, the luxury vacations, and the plastic surgery invoices, all time-stamped during the exact months I was working 16 hours a day in a fish factory. I showed the family the forged credit card applications where Melanie had used my social security number to rack up debt, and the gambling receipts from the casino where Travis had blown the property tax money. "I didn't give you a house drowning in debt," I said, looking directly at my sobbing mother. "I gave you the house you created. I gave you the bills you refused to pay, and the responsibilities you ignored while you were busy stealing from me." Melanie tried to scream that the documents were faked, but Uncle Greg stepped forward and announced that as a former notary and bank officer, he had already turned the originals over to the county prosecutor's office and the IRS. The atmosphere in the room turned from curiosity to pure disgust, as our relatives realized they had been socializing with thieves who had exploited a single mother's sacrifice. My mother fell to her knees crying about how she was just trying to keep the family together, but I didn't move to help her. I looked at Travis, who was now trembling as he realized that the gift deed he signed wasn't just a transfer of property, but a legal confession that he was now the sole person responsible for the fraudulent second mortgage Melanie had taken out. The pride they had felt 5 months ago had turned into a public execution of their reputations. They had come to the party hoping to find new victims to parasite off of, but they found only the cold, hard truth of their own greed displayed for everyone to see. As the police whom Greg had contacted earlier regarding the identity theft entered the back of the hall, I picked up Chloe and prepared to leave. I had spent 3 years in the cold of Niigata, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly warm. The sound of the heavy iron doors at the county courthouse closing behind me felt like the final period at the end of a long, painful sentence. In the weeks following the confrontation at the anniversary party, the dominoes fell exactly as Mr. Sterling and Uncle Greg had predicted. Because Melanie had used my identity to forge credit documents and insurance papers, she was charged with multiple counts of identity theft and financial fraud, eventually accepting a plea deal that included a significant prison sentence and a lifetime of restitution payments. Travis, unable to prove he wasn't a co-conspirator and facing a massive mountain of debt from the house he so desperately wanted to own, saw his credit score drop into the low 300s as the bank officially foreclosed on the property. My mother, Deborah, was evicted 3 weeks later when the sheriff's department arrived to clear the premises for a public auction. I heard from a distant cousin that she tried to move in with several relatives, but the evidence of her complicity in stealing from her own daughter had spread like wildfire through the family grapevine, and every door was firmly shut in her face. She ended up in a small, subsidized senior housing unit, the very life of poverty she had tried to avoid by leeching off my hard work in Niigata. I didn't feel joy at their suffering, but I felt a profound sense of relief that the cycle of exploitation had finally been broken. I used the small portion of savings I had kept hidden in a Japanese bank account to move Chloe and me to a quiet town in a different state, far away from the toxic shadows of our past. I found a job in a local logistics firm where my experience with international shipping and my fluency in Japanese, gained during those cold years in Niigata, were highly valued and well compensated. More importantly, I finally had the time to be the mother Chloe deserved. We spent our weekends at the park or simply reading books in our sunny living room, a space that belonged to us and was free from the tension of greedy eyes. I realized that for years I had been conditioned to believe that family meant unconditional sacrifice, even if that sacrifice was being fed into a bottomless pit of selfishness. I had to go to the other side of the world and lose almost everything to understand that love, without boundaries, is just an invitation for abuse. My daughter is now thriving in a school where she is known for her bright smile rather than her tattered clothes, and she no longer flinches when a door closes too loudly. Looking back at my time in Niigata, I no longer see it as a period of wasted youth. It was the crucible that forged my strength. I am proud of the calluses that once covered my hands, for they are the reason I can now hold my daughter's hand with such confidence. I have learned that being a good daughter does not mean allowing yourself to be a victim, and that the most important person you can ever save is yourself. My journey from the frozen factories of Japan to the warmth of my own independent home taught me that your value is not defined by how much you can give to others, but by the respect you demand for yourself. I have closed the book on that chapter of my life, and as I watch the sunset from my new porch, I know that the cold will never reach us again. To anyone standing where I once stood, remember that your silence is their power, and your courage is their greatest fear. Do not be afraid to set the world on fire if it is the only way to see the truth. Through her arduous journey, Monica delivers a powerful message to the audience. Family is a bond of blood, but respect is the currency of a healthy relationship. Sacrifice only carries true meaning when it is placed in the right hands and given to those who are deserving. Never confuse filial piety with submitting to exploitation. Monica's decision to penalize her family was not an act of blind revenge, but a necessary step to secure the future for herself and her daughter. The story serves as a stark reminder that at times, establishing clear legal and financial boundaries is the only way to rescue oneself from toxic relatives. Money can be earned back, but time and trust are lost forever. Never let greed turn your home into a battlefield.